Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. While Republicans are busy preparing for a Trump administration, Democrats are doing some soul searching.
When you lose the White House to the least popular candidate in the history of America, when you lose the Senate, when you lose the House, and when 2/3 of governors in this country are Republicans, it is time for a new direction for the Democratic Party.
One of those auditioning for the job as the new head of the Democratic Party is Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison. He joins us from Minneapolis. Congressman, what should the new direction for the Democratic Party be?
Well, we've got to strengthen the grassroots. You know, we got 3,141 counties and many, many cities across this country where Democrats are thriving and working every day. The power needs to be in their hands. We need to make sure the resources are with them and everything else. We need to prioritize voter turnout. And that doesn't mean get out the vote at the end of the election. That means 365-day a year engagement, relationship building with voters around what their priorities are. We got to make sure that the Democratic Party is not just democratic, but seen to be democratic. That means we got to have systems in place to make sure that everybody who participates in a primary is perceived to have an equal shot with everybody else. And we got to make sure that,
Well, no, continue your list.
Well, I mean, and we've got to also create more collaboration. I mean, we have Democrats who hold office in secretaries of state. And those folks run the election. We need to stand up for them. City officials, college Dems, organized labor needs to have a whole lot more say-so and a lot more respect in the Democratic Party. We've got to make sure our veterans, Democratic veterans, are strengthened and feel like they are fully included. We have got to just make sure that the Democratic rank and file really owns the party and feels that it is theirs, that it is fair, and that's what we've got to do.
The reason I wanted you to finish your list is I noticed Donald Trump wasn't in it. There are a lot of Democrats who are organizing, planning, and setting themselves up as an opposition party to Donald Trump and using that as an organizing principle. That wasn't in your list. How should Democrats think about Donald Trump? 100% opposed? Work with him?
Well, Donald Trump has already proven where he's going with this thing. I mean, there was a Political article that entitled, "Why Wall Street is Suddenly in Love with Donald Trump." He's not draining the swamp. He's filling it up more, and there's going to be more swamp creatures than ever before. I mean, he is lobbyists and big-time investment bankers. He's not doing what he said he was going to do for average working Americans. And we have got to be there to work with all those folks who may have not voted or even voted for him. They are our natural constituents, but we've got to show them that we really care about them, that we respect their voice, and that we are going to be fighting for them tooth and nail. But I would say to Democrats, we should not make Donald Trump the focal point of all of our energy. We need to make the people, the average workaday American, who we are fighting for, and make that crystal clear every single day. The reason we didn't...
Let me ask you, Congressman, one of the arguments some Democrats make is that Democrats should not normalize, it's a buzzword you hear constantly, Donald Trump, not treat him as a normal president. What's your advice to Democrats about that?
Well, we should be authentic, and he's clearly not normal. He talked about jobs, and yet he has hurt workers all over this country. In Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and even in Florida, he has undermined workers. He's hurt small business people and not paid contractors. Yeah, his level of abuse of working people is extraordinary. And not to mention his racism, misogyny, extraordinary as well. It's hard to normalize that, and we can never do it. But I would just say that it's not about Donald Trump. We're gonna fight him because he stands against our value system. But if we make the average American's needs our priority, people who want to retire, people who want to see their kids go to college, people who want to earn a decent living, people anxious about the plant closing down, moving to another country and selling them back the products that they used to make. If we make those people the priority, we will win, and Donald Trump will be relegated to be a footnote in the dustbin of history. That is what we got to do. Focus on our people.
All right, Congressman, thanks so much for being with us, and we'll be right back with our panel.
Anytime. Thank you.
Saturday Night Live made light of the policy challenges ahead for the new Trump administration, but in all seriousness, whether the president-elect will stick with his campaign promises And if so, can they be enacted, are big questions. So we've assembled a panel of experts who have mostly conservative leanings to help us understand just how enormous some of those challenges are. Lanhee Chen served as policy director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. He is also a CNN political commentator and a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Grover Norquist is president of the conservative group Americans for Tax Reform. Maya McGinnis is president of the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic and a former speechwriter for George W. Bush. David, I want to start with you on this question of potential conflicts, relationship between Donald Trump, the president, and the Trump businesses. What do you make of their initial responses about how that will be handled?
Not good. I think the first order of business, the very first order of business for Republicans who want to ensure a successful administration is to corruption-proof the administration. It's going to be a big problem. And the surest way to do that is to pass a law formalizing the long tradition that the president must publish his tax returns. It may or may not be possible. The president may or may not be willing to divest himself. But the way for the public to be protected is for people to know what the president has, whether he receives any benefit. Because of the particular nature of Donald Trump's businesses, everything that happens at the Trump organization flows into his tax return. So if we can see the tax return, we can know, is anyone trying to bribe him? Has anyone succeeded?
Grover, the Donald Trump campaigned on draining the swamp. He campaigned on getting rid of the self-dealing in Washington. It was not a small issue. So when Mike Pence was kind of vague, he said, trust me, it'll all get worked out. Wouldn't you expect kind of brighter lines from a candidate who spent so much time talking about changing Washington?
Yeah, and look, you want to change all of Washington. The focus on Trump is interesting, but there's a House, there's a Senate, there are governors, there's an entire bureaucracy. We need to reduce the amount of money the federal government spends. If you don't want people stealing some of it, the best way to do that is to have less of it spent. Very important that the Republicans maintain their ban on earmarks. That earmarks have been the currency of corruption in Washington, D.C. for years and years and years. The Republicans ended that. Some people want to bring it back. We should make sure, one, we stop that, and two, instead of having money for roads come to Washington, D.C., where we then send it back out with a series of regulations and strings on it, including the Davis-Bacon Act, which is a racist act passed in the 1930s to keep African Americans from competing in those jobs. It should be repealed simply because it's racist. But it also raises the cost of building anything in the United States that the federal government touches by 25 to 33%. We should, one, get rid of the Davis-Bacon Act. West Virginia just got rid of their version of the Davis-Bacon Act. Wisconsin did. A number of states abolished that. We should at the federal level, and we should let states raise their own money and build their own roads. You bring trillions into Washington, D.C. to spend, we'll corrupt things.
Lanhee, Grover just had a nice detailed list there of things that need to be done. So that's one area. But still, back to the president, who is no small actor in politics in Washington. What could he do? What other than what David suggested, which is publishing those tax returns, what else might you expect from a president who ran so forcefully on the idea of changing the way Washington works in terms of his own relationships?
Well, I think certainly he should hold himself to a higher standard. And if there are concerns particularly about what's happening within the dealings in his family business, he should think about ways to put up more vigorous firewalls, frankly, between what his family is doing with the business and what he might be doing with the people's business as president. So I think it's important for him to think about that. I think this issue of lobbyists also is important. I think that the administration, or the president-elect's administration, kind of turning around and saying, look, we are going to make a serious effort to ensure that there isn't the kind of revolving door that we may have seen in previous administrations. By putting in place, for example, this 5-year ban, I think that's a great idea. Remember, the essence of the Trump candidacy is as the outsider. And it's crucially important for his credibility, but also the credibility of Republicans who are elected with him, for him to behave in a way that is completely above reproach.
Let me ask you now, switching and going back to Grover's point a little bit, the budget. So we have promises that were made on the campaign trail, and then we have the reality of the budget. Where should people trying to figure out where the rubber meets the road, what should they look to?
Right. So first, for starters, President-elect Trump is going to be inheriting the worst fiscal situation of any president as judged by the debt relative to the economy, other than President Truman when he's walking into office. So he's got a tough starting point. He spent a lot of time on the campaign talking about the importance of getting that $20 trillion debt back down. And yet, we looked at the proposals that he put forth during the campaign. They would, in fact, add over $5 trillion to the national debt And that's on top of borrowing $9 trillion that we are poised to do if we do nothing. So he has a huge challenge ahead of him. He's also going to be working with a Republican Congress that for years has said it's very important to balance the budget over a 10-year period. The question is, now that they have the House, the Senate, and the White House, are they suddenly going to pull back from those fiscal goals because he has these unpaid for tax cuts, infrastructure spending, increases in defense, a lot of things that would actually balloon the debt? Or are they going to hold to those fiscal goals, which are very important for both getting the debt under control and actually helping to grow the economy, which is the other major goal?
You know, John, I think the flip side of that also is Donald Trump during the campaign did not say very much about Medicare or Social Security. Now remember, the three biggest drivers of federal deficit and debt going forward are healthcare spending, Social Security, and net interest on the debt. So unless we do something about those quickly, this is a problem like compounding interest is a good thing when you invest. This is the opposite of that. Yeah. And so it is crucially important, and I'm glad to see, by the way, that Republicans have begun to focus on Medicare reform, because that is the more intractable, I think, of the two problems between Medicare and Social Security. But it's also important for him, I think, to revisit what he said during the campaign, which is that he didn't want to touch Social Security.
That's right.
I think it's important that we look at things like the retirement age and also the growth of benefits.
But there's something kind of surreal about this, because we are in a city now that has had for a long time a two-party system. And it's now a three-party system. There's a Republican Party, a Democratic Party, and a Trump Party. And the Republican Party has priorities, and Lonnie is the eminent expert on what those are and should be, and they're right and important. But the president also has his own priorities, and they are summed up with that photograph of him with those dubious Indian businessmen giving the thumbs up sign that was tweeted out. And what is going to be very important is for the Republican Party to accomplish its goals, it must prevent the Trump Party from accomplishing its goals, which are of a very different and much dirtier order.
You can start where there's tremendous agreement. The tax proposal that Trump has put forward is very similar to the one that's been put forward by the House Republicans, Brady in the Ways and Means Committee, and Paul Ryan. Taking the corporate rate from 35 to 20 or 15, I prefer Trump's 15, but 20's progress, would be tremendous for economic growth. Going to full expensing, which both plans haven't, would shoot up growth. You'd look at growth going from 2% to 4%. And the most important thing that the President and the House and Senate can do is get economic growth back on path. We've had a very anemic growth, a recovery. We've been in recovery for 7.5 years, but it's been the lousiest recovery in a long time. We need to be growing at 4%. If you grow for a decade at 4% instead of 2%, the federal government nets $5+ trillion in additional revenue.
Have we ever
from higher
grown at
taxes
4% for 10 years?
under Reagan. Yes.
Well, he was only president for 8. But
No, but out until Bush decided to raise taxes and undo.
So let me point out some of the differences, though, because as a big proponent of tax reform, there actually are some important differences, which is the Donald Trump tax plan would lose trillions of dollars, where the members of the Republican Party are saying tax reform should be revenue neutral. And I think that's a really important objective.
With dynamic scoring.
Because to add up with spending proposals, taking entitlements off the table, which I think is a very unwise idea and really stands in the way of getting this done, and dealing with the debt, you can't have a big loss from your tax reform. In terms of growing the economy, there's a big difference now than when we saw growth before. Right now, our economy is projected to grow at about 2%, and Donald Trump talked about growth rates of twice or 3 times that much. But we have a big challenge, which is changing demographics. As the baby boomers all move into retirement, in order to get those higher growth rates, you'd have to have productivity levels we've actually never seen in this country. So I think one thing that's really important here is let's aspire to grow the economy. You do that through tax reform, through public investments, but you also do that for paying for your proposals and controlling the debt. But let's not wish for it and assume sort of magical numbers that are unlikely to materialize.
If you want to do those things, and the things that Grover's talking about, and I would agree with all of them, more or less. If you want to do those things, you have to prevent this administration from being devoured and consumed by scandal. Donald Trump has made it pretty clear his plan is to run the least transparent and probably the least ethical administration in a long, long time. If any of this is to happen, this administration must be Trump-proofed. The president is up to no good. He's made that very clear. He's indicating to the Japanese, if you've got business with me, this is the person to talk to. He's indicating to the Indians, if you have business with me, these are the people to talk to. If he does that, I guarantee you 18 months from now, when you convene the show, you will not be talking about taxes, you'll not be talking about that, you will be talking about the latest Trump scandal. Act now to save the country, the political system and the Republican Party from the things this president seems to have in mind.
Let me ask another question, Lenny, of you about other ways capital can be spent, which is, we've talked about budget and tax reform, but there are other things Trump has on the priorities list. Immigration is one of them. How hard do you think that will be, and do you think that will expend some capital in terms of political capital that then can't be used on these very hard other things, tax reform, Medicare, and so forth?
I think it's a very dangerous thing to start with. I mean, obviously it was a campaign priority, so it's important to the president-elect. We recognize that that's going to be a priority for this administration. But you think about all of the other important issues, and we've talked about some of them, certainly tax reform. What's going to happen with Obamacare? This is something that has been a signature issue for Republicans for the last 6 years since the law was passed and signed into law. What is going to be done in terms of the repeal? And more importantly, I think, is the question about what you're going to replace it with. You know, I'm a little alarmed that we seem to be thinking that we can kick the can down the road on the replacement of the Affordable Care Act. There are some very important policy goals that Republicans have been working to accomplish for some time. For example, parity in the tax treatment of health care between those who get their health care from their employers and those who buy it on their own. That is something that should be a focus of the discussion, and we need to be focusing on that first, I think, rather than some of these other issues, which frankly I don't think have as much potential to grow the economy, certainly not in the way that Mr. Trump has talked about them.
Grover?
Well, I think on health care, and Trump has spoken to this, allowing people from New Jersey to buy their insurance from companies in Iowa, allowing you to cross borders. Even the government said that would drop the cost about 15%. That's an important reform that makes all the other reforms easier. We need to get spending down as well as regulations. We've been talking about taxes, but the Reduce Act that Ken Calvert has put forward to reduce the number of civilian employees at the Pentagon by 15%. They've grown 15% in the Bush-Obama years.
But they're going to grow more under Donald Trump, who's talking about a big plus up in spending on defense.
First of all, he wants to talk about putting more troops on, but I'm talking about the civilian employees. Mm-hmm. Troops have gone down 4% during that period. The civilian population has gone up 15%. What Reduce Act does is simply takes it back down 15%, back to where it had been compared to the number of troops you have. That saves $80 billion in 5 years. That's an important reform, and if we're going to do more on the military in some areas, we need to get rid of the wasteful spending that we don't need to do. And Calvert's got a very important bill.
Let me ask, add to whatever your answer is going to be in the last 40 seconds here. Donald Trump, $1 trillion infrastructure bill. Mm-hmm. How does that fit in the coming budget? Quite challenges that exist.
Right. So infrastructure is one of the few areas where both Democrats and Republicans tend to agree that we need to do more spending there. But if you look at what the Congressional Budget Office found, we know that infrastructure can be a very important component of an economic growth strategy. But they also found that if you borrow to do that, it will actually shrink the economy. The same way that Wharton found that if you borrow to do a big tax cut, it could shrink the economy. So I think the problem that we have, the big challenge is, one, Grover's focusing on the spending. That's really the smaller parts of the budget. I think we need to look at the big parts of the budget. Back to entitlements, that's 50% of the budget, 75% of the growth. And two, if you want to grow the economy, you can't borrow your way to growth. We have to get control of the national debt. So they're going to have to make choices. That's what budgets are. It's about choices. We are moving from campaigning to governing, and now we have to look at the real choices.
All right, we're going to have to stop it there. We'll look forward to come back and talk about the choices later. Thanks to all of you. And I want to be, just stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. And we're joined now by Max Stier, an expert in presidential transitions and the president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service. Max, I just want to start with, give us a sense of the scope of a transition.
Transitions are huge. When you think about this, it's the largest, most important takeover of any organization, not just on the planet, but in history. You have a $4 trillion organization. You have 4 million people when you count the military. You have 4,000 political appointees. I might add that's a little bit of a vestige of this spoil system. So talk about drain the swamp, another conversation. It's 1,100 of those 4,000 have to go through the Senate confirmation process. You have to put together a budget. You have to deal with not only all the things that are coming at you, but things you cannot expect, the asteroids that inevitably take place in a world as dangerous as this one.
And so that's why both campaigns, although now only it matters that the Trump campaign started their transition work a while ago. But how much, if they started months ago, of this work can be done ahead of time?
Well, you're exactly right. If you only focus on the period between the election and inauguration, there's no possible way that you can be ready. You have to start earlier. Both campaigns did. Clinton and Trump did very, very strong work. The hard part comes now because, as you're right, there's only so much you can do pre-election, and then you have to merge your campaign and your transition apparatus, but you have to move over real fast. Most folks, I think, are looking through the wrong end of the telescope. They're examining one or two appointments as they come forward here. The reality is that you have to look at what are the goals that the transition teams are actually taking on. They ought to be taking on the proposition that they need to make sure that they have their team on the field, an equipped team from day one, from the second that they actually run the government. Transitions are also the point of maximum vulnerability for us. In a post 9/11 world, we have to make sure that the new president has their team in place, that they have a game plan, and they're ready to go from second one after they swear on that Bible.
And how possible is that realistically, though? Or if not, give us some number of months that it might take to get a team fully in place.
Look, I think it is more than anybody can ever fully get done, but they have to move the ball further down the field than anyone has done it before. I think people are looking the wrong way when they look in the rearview mirror and say, how much did Barack Obama did? How much did President Bush do? The real question is, can you get that team in place and the right team in real time? For us, that means making sure you have your White House fully staffed by right after the inauguration, that you have 100 of your top Senate confirmed people in place. And that means you've got to move with dispatch. And you have to be thinking about this as teams, not as single individuals, because you'll never get there if you add 1-1-1. You got to do it in bigger groups.
So where is the Trump team on your got to move fast timeline?
Well, too early to tell. I think the more important point is not how many people have they named, but rather have they embraced the objective, the objective of making sure they actually are ready to go on day one, that they'll have their team in place, that they'll have their game plan designed, and that they've built the relationships that they need with critical stakeholders, Congress, the federal workforce, and others.
Last 30 seconds, we've talked about quantity. Talk about quality, though. Some of these people are going to be picked. You'll never hear about them, but they'll have real power.
You're 100% right. We've actually been producing job descriptions, position descriptions of those 4,000 jobs. They don't exist otherwise. We need people here who are not just outsiders or not just people who have the policy alignment that the president-elect wants, but people who can actually manage real large organizations. If you look in the past, whether it was Hurricane Katrina, healthcare.gov, these are management problems. We need to make sure the government is staffed at the very top leadership positions with the very best experienced people we can possibly get.
All right, Max Stier, thank you so much for that description. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.